Fairness Doctrine was a rule created in 1949 that required television and radio stations to air programs discussing public issues and to include a variety of views about controversial issues of public importance in their overall programming. The Federal Communications Commission introduced the Fairness Doctrine because, at the time, the U.S. Supreme Court claimed that spectrum scarcity was the reason that broadcast needed to be regulated. And spectrum scarcity refers to the small space available in the broadcast spectrum that limited the number of segments that could be used in the broadcast spectrum without causing interference. Because of this limitation, the FCC wanted to make sure that the few broadcast segments available accommodated everybody and gave information about all sides of controversial topics. At the time, it made more sense than it would today, but even in its time, it wasn't successful. There's a growing number of people arguing today that due to increased partisanship in media, a return to the Fairness Doctrine is needed. They view it as a potential solution to the divisive problems of our contemporary media environment that would particularly mitigate false information and biased media outlets. I disagree with the belief that it would solve this problem and believe that a return to the Fairness Doctrine is not only not necessary, but would actually be harmful. As technology has developed, we've moved further away from the issues that caused it to be put in place at all. Today, we're advanced to the point that spectrum scarcity is no longer an issue. In our social media age, there are millions of stations to watch, podcasts to listen to, content creators to subscribe to, that we can find whatever information we desire to whenever we want. And naturally, we follow and listen to people reinforcing what we already believe. If stations that we like because they spin the news in ways that we want them to start having to broadcast opposing viewpoints, we could potentially get more biased towards our side anyway. A study was done in 2018 that found that exposure to opposing views on social media can increase political polarization. The researchers said, quote, social media sites are often blamed for exacerbating political polarization by creating echo chambers that prevent people from being exposed to information that contradicts their pre-existing beliefs. We conducted a field experiment that offered a large group of Democrats and Republicans financial compensation to follow bots that retweeted messages by elected officials and opinion leaders with opposing political views. Republican participants expressed substantially more conservative views after following a liberal Twitter bot, whereas Democrats' attitudes became slightly more liberal after following a conservative Twitter bot. This study has important implications for the emerging field of computational social science and ongoing efforts to reduce political polarization online." End quote. In theory, the Fairness Doctrine was supposed to assure that the public had access to a wide marketplace of ideas, but in reality, it barely worked, even in its time period. It didn't work because enforcing fairness is confusing and often subjective. It also didn't work because enforcement of it relied on listeners filing complaints when stations failed to comply, but stations and people complaining would often confuse the provisions of the Fairness Doctrine. Along with this, one author, Perlman, says in her article titled, "Why Bringing Back the Fairness Doctrine Won't Cure What Ails Modern Media," quote, "Some stations ignored the affirmative obligation to address controversial topics and avoided tackling them altogether. Broadcast networks tightened their control over their new divisions, asserting that airing documentaries produced by independents or non-U.S. media companies could render affiliates vulnerable to Fairness Doctrine complaints. Paradoxically, the rule may have diminished the marketplace of ideas while shoring up network control over national public affairs programming." End quote. The rules of the Fairness Doctrine were difficult to enforce, and to avoid dealing with its restrictions, many stations wouldn't air controversial content at all, or would put an unfair or flawed spin on opposing beliefs that they disagreed with by allowing unqualified or inexperienced people from opposing sides to talk on their program and make their side look bad, or they could just twist information in a way that made other sides look bad while claiming that they weren't doing so. The Fairness Doctrine barely worked in its time, and as I've already mentioned, our technological developments have eliminated the need for this kind of rule in broadcast, social media, or any media at all. It could potentially lead to even more polarization in media and would be difficult to enforce to the point that many stations would avoid airing controversial content or would put an unfair spin on opposing content that they were being forced to air. For these reasons, it could potentially harm our already existing wide marketplace of ideas that we take part in through our media consumption and use. While the Fairness Doctrine may not work, the issue still remains of increasing and harmful partisanship in media that is dividing the nation and the world as a whole. How do we deal with this if not for a law such as the Fairness Doctrine? The only way we can decrease partisanship is by learning to be less hateful and more accepting of each other. You can't force people to listen to one another. It only makes them more adamant on disagreeing. We have to actively try to understand the other side and why they believe what they do, and we have to look at issues from perspectives besides just our own and try to see things from others' points of view. We have to be more open in our thinking and evaluate the media that we consume, even if it's from a source that we like or from a viewpoint that we agree with. We can do this by individually taking responsibility for the media we consume and actively evaluating if it's true or just biased in a way that we like or agree with. Partisanship and bias in media are complicated issues that government laws and regulations cannot simply fix. We have to use media responsibly as individuals and learn to listen to others that we disagree with. Thank you.